A gift to parents. We should live in the will of God so that we will bring happiness into our parents' lives rather than sadness. Here now is Gene Getz.
I've actually entitled these verses here in Proverbs, Joy and Delight. And it's a powerful statement, and I think many of us can identify with the truth of this proverb. The father of a righteous son will rejoice greatly, and one who fathers a wise son will delight in him. Let your father and mother have joy, and let her who gave birth to you rejoice. And I think you can see the relationship between the principle and these statements here in Proverbs. That is, we should live in the will of God, so we'll bring happiness to our parents rather than sadness. We can move on to another proverb I've entitled this, Joy or Heartache. A wise son brings joy to his father, but a foolish son, heartache to his mother. Now, I'm not sure exactly why he isolated the father and the mother here in describing joy or heartache, but still the message comes through. And I think that one of the points that the proverb gives us is the contrast between joy of the heart through obedient children and heartache that we feel when there's disobedience and walking out of the will of God. Those of us who are parents, have grown children, many of us can identify with one or the other, hopefully more so with the joy that comes through obedient children rather than disobedient children. Here's another one that is on the negative side, grief and bitterness. A foolish son is grief to his father, and bitterness to the one who bore him, that is, obviously, his mother. Now, in these Proverbs, of course, very obvious, the focus is on the son. And it's possible that in this proverb, Solomon's thinking of his own son. He's thinking of his own relationship to his own father, David. We're not totally sure of all the dynamics that are here in his thinking, but what he says about the son certainly applies to both children, sons and daughters. And the principle, of course, incorporates both. Now, when you think about these proverbs, when you think about the focus on the family, father, mother, sons, daughters, when you get to the New Testament, you have a beautiful parallel, certainly applying to us who are parents. But the interesting thing is that when you get to the New Testament, the family structure becomes the basis of what we call the family of God. Many of the churches in the New Testament began as households. Philemon and his household, the Philippian jailer and his household, along with Lydia and her household. And as the churches grew, they became multiple families together, which Paul calls the household of God. And that family model, that household model that we have involving fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, really becomes, in many respects, the model for the family of God. And we see the relationship between these proverbs as it relates to our biological families when it comes to the family of God. For example, here is John the Apostle writing in his old age. This happens to be in the third epistle that he wrote. Just one chapter in our Bibles, but in verse 4, I've called this greater joy because the word is used right here in this statement by John. And he's looking back over all of his years of ministry. As I said, he's in his 90s. And he says, I have no greater joy than this, to hear that my children are walking in the truth. And obviously here he's talking about believers. He's talking about the children of God. He's talking about the fact that he as an apostle, in a sense, was a father. And he was able to bring many people to Christ. And he considers them children in the faith. And he said, the greatest joy I have looking back over whatever happened in my life, all these years of ministry, is the joy, the great joy when I see my children, the children I, in a sense, birthed through the gospel, walking in the will of God, living in the will of God. And that's such a great truth and reality for all of us in ministry, but especially for those of us who have been in the ministry for quite some time. I've been there for quite a while. And I had the privilege, for example, way back in the 70s, about 1974, to publish a book called The Measure of a Man. And it really was a book that grew out of my ministry, particularly on the basis of the characteristics that Paul outlines in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1, which are basically the qualities for maturity, qualities for spiritual leadership particularly, though certainly qualities for all of us as believers, goals for our lives. Little did I realize that here now, over 40 years later, going towards 50 years, that book has been in print, never gone out of print. And that's a miracle in itself, because the average life of a book is 2 to 3 to 4 years, generally speaking. Now, the reason it's never gone out of print is not because I wrote it. The reason is because I borrowed the outline from the Apostle Paul, and we all know where he got it, directly from the Lord. I just brought it into the 20th and 21st century. I had the opportunity and the privilege. I sometimes say when we get to heaven, Paul will get the rewards and I'll be penalized for plagiarism. But the fact is, I think it's common property, no problem there. But here's why I share this. Today, as I go out and speak, as I think of just the past year, as I stand here, just reflecting back on the past year, in almost every conference that I've spoken in, I've had men come up to me and say, I want to thank you for that book. It was the first book that I ever read on Christian maturity after I became a Christian years ago. I was still in college. And of course, today he's, 50 or 55 years of age, having been touched by a book that I wrote all those years ago. And it's the Word of God. But the thing I'm illustrating is, what do you think happens to my emotions, to my heart, every time I get that feedback? A person whose life has been touched and he's growing spiritually. Now, I'm sure the Apostle John felt those emotions a multitude times beyond mine. But it's so thrilling when you see your own people that you minister to. As parents, yes. But as spiritual leaders in the family of God, to see people walking with the Lord because you've been able to touch their lives. But there's an opposite to that. Just as we've seen in these Proverbs, there's joy and then there's sorrow. There's happiness and then there's pain. And Paul talked about this when he wrote to the Galatians. And he used a fascinating metaphor here. Labor pains. He actually used a metaphor of a mother giving birth to a child. Now, the reason he used that metaphor is because what he's talking about is that he helped give birth to people, the new birth, to come to Christ. And so he says, my children, I am again suffering labor pains for you until Christ is formed in you. Now, those of you who are mothers who've given birth can really identify more so with what he's talking about. But basically, if you reconstruct it, he wrote this to the Galatians. And the Galatian churches were founded on the first missionary journey when he and Barnabas went into that region and came up over the mountains to Antioch of Pisidia. That's different than Antioch of Syria. And he was persecuted there, but there were believers. They had to leave because of persecution. They went on down to Iconium, and they had to leave there, but there were many who believed because of their ministry. Then he went on down to Lystra, and they came to Lystra, and what happened to him in Lystra? He was taken out of the city and actually stoned and left for dead. Now, when you realize the context, and he's writing to those Galatian churches, many of them that had been sidetracked from the gospel and from the truth of the gospel by false teachers, then you understand why he says, "My children, I am again suffering labor pains for you until Christ is formed in you." When you came to know the new birth, I suffered in order to preach the gospel to you. And that gives tremendous meaning, because he's saying, now that you're walking out of the will of God, I feel pain, I feel heartache, I feel sorrow, just like a father with his own children or son that's walking out of the will of God. And so it's a powerful, gripping metaphor. And it gives us tremendous illustrations from the life of these New Testament believers and what they really meant by joy or sorrow. I've never experienced that kind of sorrow, obviously. I hope I never do through persecution. But as I reflect back on my own ministry, as I reflect back on the difficulties and the challenges and the greatest sorrow that I have felt, number one is betrayal. Someone you've built your life into, and they betray you. They betray you as they turn their back on God, they turn their back on you. I've had that happen. Not often, but when it happened, it was painful. A very painful experience to see someone that you know as a believer, you built your life into, but who walks out of the will of God. I've had that happen by people who deliberately walk out of the will of God. And I think of two people, for example, that walked out of the will of God. And to this day, although it happened years ago, when I drive by a certain location, I feel a certain amount of pain because I saw them turn their back on God and I saw what happened in their lives. You can't get away from that as a shepherd, a pastor, a parent, which is the basis, of course, of the application into the New Testament. The question is, how can children bring happiness to parents who are immature, controlling, and possessive? And I'm just going to say a word about that. And here we're not talking about older parents who are in deep need physically, emotionally, mentally. We're talking about people, parents who know what they're doing. And they're persistently and purposely controlling and possessive. And one of the great challenges that we face, and I've had to advise couples whose, for example, a mother who insisted on calling her daughter every day. What do you think that did to her husband? That's threatening. That's interfering. And I had to say, you got to have some guidelines. Tough love. You've got to say, I love you, but you can't control this situation. And from there, you very sensitively but directly deal with the situation so that there is not interference into that family. There's truly leaving father and mother physically and emotionally in order to build your own family. Hopefully, those issues can be resolved. So here's the principle. We should live in the will of God so that we will bring happiness into our parents' lives rather than sadness.